start. "32 seconds. All right, and what we're seeing here first is that the carbon filter we're using is not taking out any chlorine, but the chlorine is only about 1.2, maybe 0.8, definitely darker than 0.6. So let's call it 1.2 parts per million. So even though that's a new carbon filter up there through here. And it looks like the system water is running about 6.43, 42, you know, and that's within 1/10 of a pH of what I was seeing last night. So I'm just out. We won't have to do it tomorrow. We'll start here. Order that we need them. First, we need a liquefying enzyme. So we're going to use Termamil SC. It's produced by the Novosomes company. And it is a fungal enzyme. It's grown on a fungus. It's genetically modified, and it's designed to create long starch chains and break them up into shorter starch chains. And we'll add that during cooking. We're going to add a split dose, but it will definitely liquefy the starch and get it going, ready for the sugar-making enzyme. This is a second enzyme. It's called Novosome 25001. It's also applied as a split dose. After we have allowed this to work and liquefy the starch, we're going to drop this temperature further, and we're going to adjust the pH, and it is a glucoamylase. This is primarily what you would substitute for an alpha amylase. You would use malt for this enzyme. You'd also use malt for this enzyme if you did it in a two-stage process. This is all the yeast we're going to need for 500 gallons. It's 1 pound of yeast, and actually we're going to overdose a little. There's no real adverse effect of overdosing, and this is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it is the standard distiller's yeast. It's also baker's yeast. It's what you use in order to bake bread rise. The carbon dioxide of the yeast byproduct is what makes flour rise. And we'll pre-start some of this yeast in those buckets, and we'll make sure that it's active. And yeast have to have a very comfortable environment, which is why we're taking time to check the chlorine, because we don't want chlorine in the water in order to prevent the yeast from growing. And we want the pH correct, because the yeast can't have a pH that's too acidic at too early a stage in the fermentation. And we want them to be well fed. We want them to have glycerol, things to make their cell walls out of, and things to conduct their metabolism. The other thing we want to do is to make sure that the yeast operate at the right temperature. And so we'll set the batch about 88 degrees, and the metabolic activity of the yeast will increase the temperature. That big vat over there is going to actually rise to 92, 93 degrees, which is pretty hot for the yeast. So we may end up cooling it. Fortunately, it's fall, it's cold. We can get the shop cold so that they won't. That's why you don't work yeast off in the summertime. August, it's just too hot. Unless you have an external source of chilling, the yeast metabolism will get too hot, and they'll start making products that you don't want. There are other metabolic pathways other than ethanol alcohol production, and if you get to a high temperature, you're going to start using those metabolic pathways, and you're going to make more acetone, you're going to make more methanol, you're going to make more methyl acetate, you're going to make all sorts of things that you don't necessarily want your whiskey to taste like. That's what clean whiskey will look like. I see that there's nothing floating around in the top of the tank, which is a good sign. A little something there, but this is a spick and span tank right at the moment. This is as clean as it gets all year. So that was pretty close. I set it for 37 minutes. And there's no margin of error for filling this tank. I mean, we are putting in exactly as much water as this thing can possibly handle. because we put in so much starch. We are going to put 1,500 pounds of corn into this, and that's going to give us a beer that's only 14 gallons of water per bushel. And that's a very, very thick beer. Old distillers would start with 35-gallon beers and 25-gallon beers, but now with the enzymes you can run very high-density, high-starch beers. The liquefying enzymes prevent it from clumping up and turning into corn mash or corn mush. I mean, even with a hydraulic thing, it would just be like mixing cement or mixing wallpaper paste. But the enzymes will break those chains up and make it liquid enough that you can actually start running into problems where you're making too much sugar. When you're adding the yeast, they're actually being poisoned by their own food. And so there's a balance there. On the other side, you want to put in as much starch as possible. You don't want to put in so much. Like, for instance, yeast can't really ferment molasses. You can't throw yeast in molasses and they won't do anything. It's just the sugar concentration is too high. All right, 10 gallons to go. Everything's a guess. I mean, is this thermometer really 59? You're always running with ratty data, fuzzy data, and you have to make a guess. What is the pH really? I don't know. I don't know what the pH really is. I can do my best.